Hello everyone! Tonight we are pulling back the heavy, dusty curtains of time, inviting you to step inside a quiet, slightly ominous old house, nestled deep within the Yorkshire countryside. Imagine it with me. A stiff, chilly breeze is rattling the windows, tree branches, gnarled like arthritic fingers, tap-tapping against the panes, and inside, the faint smell of damp stone and forgotten secrets hangs heavy in the air. You're cozied up, maybe under a favorite blanket, feeling safe and sound. But let me tell you, what unfolds behind these fictional walls might just give you the oddest, most deliciously uncomfortable shivers. It's a tale of whispers and judgment, of daring choices and hard-won freedom. And if you think life is a simple path, this story is about to slap you with a reality check. You probably won't survive this level of dramatic tension in your own life without reaching for a snack every 10 minutes. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. While you're at it, drop a comment with your location and local time so I can imagine you listening, tucked away wherever you are in this wide, wide world. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get going tonight. Tonight you find yourself squinting, a little curious, as we journey back to the English countryside of the mid-19th century. We're in the sleepy village of Linden Carr, a place where everyone knows everyone's business, and if they don't, they'll make it up. Our primary narrator for this wild ride, a rather earnest young farmer named Gilbert Markham, is about to introduce us to a conundrum wrapped in a riddle inside an old, crumbling estate. Now, Gilbert fancies himself quite the upstanding citizen, a bit of a catch even, with his sensible views and sturdy farm. He's lived here his whole life, seen it all, or so he thought. You can picture him now, perhaps, striding across his fields, arms behind his back, whistling a jaunty tune, blissfully unaware his perfectly predictable life is about to get thoroughly stirred up. The catalyst for this upheaval? A newcomer. Oh, the scandal! An unmarried woman, no less, moves into the long-abandoned Wildfell Hall. Now, abandoned is putting it mildly. Think dilapidated, creepy, and definitely haunted if you were casting a horror movie. It's been left to rot for years, a sort of local curiosity piece. And then, without so much as a by your leave, this mysterious Mrs. Graham, with her young son, appears on the scene. Can you imagine the gasps rippling through Sunday service? The clucking tongues over afternoon tea? This wasn't just a ripple. It was a tidal wave in a teacup, shattering the porcelain calm of Linden Carr. She doesn't court company, doesn't entertain visitors, and mostly keeps to herself. You know, like an introverted hermit who prefers peace to petty gossip. In the 19th century, this was practically a declaration of war against societal norms. For context, in Victorian society, a woman's reputation was practically her entire currency. To be unconventional was to invite scorn, often unfairly so. Historians still debate whether this rigid societal framework was more oppressive for women in the lower classes or for those, like Mrs. Graham, attempting to maintain a genteel existence without traditional male support. Gilbert, bless his inquisitive little heart, is captivated, not necessarily in a romantic way at first, but with a farmer's innate curiosity about something new and decidedly out of place. He observes her, studies her, like she's a particularly baffling strain of crop he's never encountered. He notices her quiet demeanor, her serious artistic talent, her dedication to her son. These are all admirable traits, aren't they? But in the eyes of the village they become twisted. Why is she so quiet? What is she hiding? Why doesn't she smile more? Surely she must have something to hide because, well, normal people participate in the grand old tradition of village chit-chat and minding everyone else's business, don't they? It's like moving to a small town today and opting out of Facebook. Instant pariah status, even if you're just enjoying a book. The gossip escalates with remarkable speed, as it always does when imaginations run wild. She's a widow, perhaps? Or worse, a runaway wife. Did she murder someone? Did she flee from a truly ghastly husband? You see, people in those days weren't scrolling TikTok for their daily dose of drama. They created it amongst themselves. Our dear Mrs. Graham is painted as everything from an unfortunate soul to an unrepentant sinner, often within the same breath. Even Gilbert, who starts with a grudging respect, finds himself caught up in the village's collective fascination and, dare I say, a burgeoning suspicion. There's a particular joy some people find in tearing down others, isn't there? It's almost as if judging a stranger somehow elevates their own precarious social standing. An interesting fact, and totally unrelated, but the human eye can distinguish more shades of green than any other color, perhaps explaining why lush English landscapes are so often celebrated in literature, providing the perfect backdrop for characters consumed by such intense internal green. Of envy and suspicion. Gilbert, trying to be the sensible man he believes himself to be, attempts to ignore the rumors or, at least, sift through them. He even starts paying calls, trying to understand this enigmatic woman. But each attempt to peel back a layer seems to add another, denser one. Her calm reserve, her dignified answers to increasingly impertinent questions, they only serve to make her more intriguing and, paradoxically, more suspect in the village's collective mind. You can practically hear the judgmental whispers like static on an old radio, constantly just below the surface. This Mrs. Graham, she wasn't just a new face. She was a blank canvas onto which an entire community projected their fears, their biases, and their darkest imaginings. And our earnest farmer, Gilbert, was right there, brush in hand, trying to figure out if she was a masterpiece or a cautionary tale. He doesn't realize yet that the truth is far more complex than any of them could ever imagine. He's about to get a history lesson, not just in this woman's past, but in the brutal realities faced by women who dared to defy expectations. He's about to realize that judging a book by its weathered, old-fashioned cover often means you miss the most compelling story entirely. And oh boy, what a story it's about to be. So, we've dipped our toes into the chilly waters of Wildfell Hall and met the village's resident mystery, Mrs. Graham. Gilbert, as we know, started out with a healthy dose of curiosity, which in a small, tight-knit community quickly curdles into a mixture of fascination and deep-seated suspicion. You can almost feel the air growing heavy with unanswered questions, can't you? Every glance, every hushed conversation about Mrs. Graham serves only to reinforce the prevailing notion that something is definitively off with this woman. And poor Gilbert, our supposedly level-headed farmer, isn't immune to the prevailing wind. He's like a moth to a very mysterious, slightly on-fire lamp. The village, in its infinite wisdom and absolute boredom, practically invents Mrs. Graham's scandalous backstory. Remember that game of telephone you played as a kid? Multiply that by 100 gossipy spinsters and a few bored landowners, and you have the daily information flow of Lyndon Carr. Someone spots her walking alone. Suddenly she's sullen and antisocial. Her son, little Arthur, is quiet. Clearly he's sickly or oddly precocious. She sells her paintings, a remarkable talent for a woman of her position in that era, something historians still debate whether this level of artistic autonomy was widely acceptable or typically frowned upon, and it's seen not as a source of independent income, but as further evidence of her desperation or eccentricity. Good heavens, a woman daring to earn money through her skills? Unheard of. What's next? Will she demand to vote? Don't answer that. It's far too early for those kinds of revolutionary thoughts. Gilbert, initially perhaps feeling a spark of admiration for her independence, finds himself increasingly drawn into this web of conjecture. He attempts to gain her confidence, often with the rather clunky grace of a calf learning to dance. He sees her kindness, her quiet strength, her deep affection for her son. He knows on some level that the vicious rumors flying around don't quite align with the dignified woman he encounters. Yet the pressure of collective opinion is immense. It's almost impossible to remain truly objective when everyone around you is pointing fingers and nodding in agreement. It's like trying to resist buying that trendy but ugly sweater when all your friends swear it looks fabulous on them. A particularly influential source of local wisdom comes in the form of Eliza Millward, the parson's daughter, a veritable fountain of insights and thinly veiled judgments. Eliza, being the village's unofficial social reporter, thrives on drama and suspicion. She practically injects poison into Gilbert's ear with every chance she gets, offering a running commentary of, "I told you so," and "Isn't that just like her?" You know the type, always with the side-eye and the knowing sigh. She's the personification of frenemy long before the term was invented. For example, she suggests that Mrs. Graham spends an unnatural amount of time locked away, hinting at some nefarious secret. Perhaps she's brewing illegal bathtub gin, or gasp, writing fan fiction. We are told, and this is a genuine fact, that in the 19th century, arsenic was sometimes used as a beauty product to whiten complexions, leading to numerous subtle poisonings. But thankfully, Mrs. Graham's secret, if she has one, is unlikely to involve slow-acting cosmetics. The crux of Gilbert's mounting suspicion really takes hold when Mrs. Graham discourages his romantic overtures. You see, Gilbert, despite himself, is developing feelings for her, much to Eliza's chagrin. But when he makes his intentions clear, Mrs. Graham gently but firmly rebuffs him. For a young man like Gilbert, whose sense of self-worth is clearly tied to his eligibility, this is not just rejection, it's an affront. He interprets her refusal not as personal boundaries or complex circumstances, but as proof of her hidden sin. Why else? He likely grumbles to himself, kicking at a loose stone. Would such a lovely woman turn down me? It's a classic male perspective from that era. If she says no, there must be a secret. Never mind the idea that a woman might simply not be interested, or that her past makes a relationship complicated. Such concepts were, shall we say, less commonly accepted in that glorious time period of restrictive corsets and equally restrictive social rules. His wounded pride then becomes a potent breeding ground for doubt. He starts connecting Mrs. Graham's evasiveness about her past, her solitary nature, and her careful guardianship of her son to all the salacious stories circulating. Could she really be married? To someone horrid, perhaps? Has she truly committed some terrible transgression? His mind, fueled by the relentless whisper network, spins out worst-case scenarios, often amplified by his own hurt feelings. You'd think an adult could handle rejection without concocting a conspiracy theory. But then again, how many dramatic Instagram posts have you seen after a breakup? Some things never change, do they? The only difference is they didn't have filters to make their sad faces look better. There's a tense confrontation Gilbert eventually orchestrates, corners her in a rather dramatic fashion, pressing her for answers about her past. He's behaving less like a gentleman caller and more like a tabloid reporter on a particularly juicy scoop. You can almost feel the chill in the air between them as she stands firm, her dignity her only shield against his probing questions and accusations, implicit or explicit. She remains calm, unwavering, but also unyielding, refusing to disclose anything. And this refusal, of course, serves only to solidify Gilbert's darkest suspicions. See, he thinks, if she had nothing to hide, she'd just tell me. He totally overlooks the rather important detail that it's her life, and she has every right to her privacy. The level of entitlement was quite high back then, folks. It's no wonder people needed more elaborate ways to express anger, since they couldn't just tweet their frustrations into the ether. Imagine if they could have. We'd have hashtags like #mysterious_tenant, #what are you hiding Helen, /just tell me. Gilbert, at this point you can sense the tension coiling tighter and tighter between Gilbert and Mrs. Graham, a rope twisted by rumor, misunderstanding, and Gilbert's own wounded ego. His initial, if limited, respect has given way to a strong conviction that this woman is hiding something monumental and, most likely, shameful. He believes he's being principled and discerning, when in reality he's allowing himself to be swayed by prejudice and gossip rather than trusting his own instincts about her character. He's at the precipice of losing something valuable, a potentially profound understanding of another person, all because he couldn't see past the village's distorted-looking glass. He doesn't know it yet, but this moment of absolute certainty on his part is about to be utterly shattered, leaving him to pick up the pieces of his own misguided judgments. This tangled web of misjudgment is about to unwind in a truly dramatic fashion, setting the stage for one of the most compelling narratives you could possibly imagine. And believe me, it gets far more interesting than just whispers over tea. So Gilbert, bless his naive heart, was absolutely convinced he had Mrs. Graham cornered. He'd laid out his suspicions, his wounded pride practically steaming in the chilly Yorkshire air, and he expected, what, a confession? A breakdown? A tearful admission that she was indeed a secret smuggler of artisanal cheeses? No, not quite. What he got was far more astonishing, far more profound, and certainly a million times more interesting than any village rumor could ever conjure. In a move that probably blindsided him more than an unexpected donkey kick to the shins, Mrs. Graham doesn't just defend herself verbally. Oh no, that would be far too simple for a character of such depth. Instead, before she disappears from Wildfell Hall for a significant, ominous stretch, leaving him to stew in his righteous indignation, she makes a decisive move. She entrusts him with something profoundly personal, something that peels back the layers of her enigmatic exterior with an almost brutal honesty. She gives him her journals, not just a page or two, mind you, but an entire, substantial collection. Can you imagine? It's the equivalent of someone handing you their entire unsorted hard drive, telling you to go nuts, except this is a person who has previously guarded her secrets with the ferocity of a dragon protecting its hoard of rare coins. It's a total mic drop moment, leaving Gilbert utterly dumbfounded. You can practically see him, standing there on his own, the heavy book in his hands. It's probably bound in something practical, maybe leather worn smooth by use, or sturdy cloth. You feel the weight of it, the almost sacred quiet that accompanies such an intimate possession. It's a challenge, really. "You want the truth, Mr. Markham?" she might as well have said, her voice dripping with the sort of calm certainty that could cut through stone. "Here it is, all of it. Now, dare you read it?" It's a bold move, almost impossibly so, for a woman in her position at that time. Imagine trusting the man who's been the conduit for so much gossip, and whose own suspicions were so keen, with the entirety of your private pain. She doesn't just hand over her memoirs. She's giving him a window into her very soul, and inviting him to see just how thoroughly wrong his preconceived notions have been. Now, Gilbert, to his credit, isn't so pig-headed that he immediately dismisses this extraordinary gift. He's still confused, perhaps still a little wary, but the sheer gravity of the moment, the obvious vulnerability that this act entails, is not lost on him. He takes the journals home. You can imagine him, perhaps, sitting by the dying embers of a fire, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls as he slowly, reverently, opens the first volume. He likely takes a deep breath, steeling himself, because he knows instinctively that what lies within isn't just gossip fodder. It's a life. And in the hush of that solitary room, the story truly begins. From this moment, dear listener, our narrative perspective shifts. No longer are we observing Helen through the distorted lens of village rumor or Gilbert's occasionally dim-witted observations. We are about to enter the sacred space of her own voice. The words are hers, penned in a private world where she could be utterly honest. And what unfolds in those pages is not merely a confession, but a carefully chronicled account of a woman's journey through societal expectations, personal disillusionment, and astonishing resilience. For centuries, across various cultures, personal journals served not just as private repositories of thoughts, but as a form of intellectual and emotional liberation, particularly for women who often had few other outlets for self-expression. In the 19th century especially, while publishing a diary might have been scandalous, Keeping one was often seen as a proper, pious activity, offering an unexpected paradox in a world that restricted women's voices so dramatically. Historians still debate the extent to which women in the Victorian era used private writing as a subtle form of resistance against patriarchal norms, much like Helen is doing here. The very first pages Gilbert reads transport him, and us, back in time. Helen recounts her earlier life, specifically the youthful period before her marriage. She paints a picture of a vibrant, intelligent young woman, full of ideals and an optimistic, if slightly naive, view of the world. She details her family life, her early artistic leanings, and, most crucially, her fateful encounter with Arthur Huntingdon. Think of it as a cinematic flashback sequence, only instead of a grainy sepia tone, you're experiencing it in the vivid, unvarnished detail of her own recollection. This is Helen Linton, before she became the enigmatic Mrs. Graham of Wildfell Hall. She was, you see, a young woman who thought she understood love and loyalty, probably convinced she had the pick of the litter. She's full of life, ready for adventure, utterly charming, and totally unprepared for the train wreck that destiny has in store for her. It's like watching a young couple confidently setting out on what they think is a smooth sailing cruise, unaware that their vessel is actually a slightly leaky rowboat, headed straight for hurricane-horrifying truth. This initial section of her diary is crucial. It establishes her as a fully fleshed-out human being, not just the two-dimensional villainess or wronged victim the village has painted. It reveals her vulnerabilities, her aspirations, her misjudgments, because yes, even heroines make mistakes. She chooses Arthur Huntingdon, drawn by his outward charm, his sophisticated air, and a captivating demeanor that seems to promise a life of joy and fulfillment. You'd think she'd consult a checklist. Is he a good listener? Does he do the dishes? Does he exhibit a single shred of personal integrity? But alas, Cupid's arrow in the 19th century often seemed to be tipped with glitter and blind spots. What she didn't see, what she couldn't know, was the rot beneath the dazzling surface. It's like picking out the most beautiful, shiny apple from the bushel, only to find a colossal, wriggly wormhole on the bottom. An interesting side fact: while many might assume Victorian society frowned upon all forms of intellectual engagement for women, some educated women, like Mrs. Graham, actively engaged in scientific pursuits and philosophical discussions, sometimes even writing under male pseudonyms. So her sharp intellect, evidenced in her meticulous journal entries, isn't as anomalous as the villagers might make it seem. As Gilbert devours these first pages, his preconceived notions about Mrs. Graham, the suspicions he'd carefully nurtured, begin to crumble. Each word written in Helen's hand is a chisel, chipping away at the edifice of his prejudice. He starts to see the world not as he assumed it was, but through her eyes. The experience must be transformative for him, akin to swapping out blurry spectacles for crystal clear ones, suddenly realizing the detailed reality he'd missed. It's like finding out the weird new neighbor is actually a super spy with a noble, heartbreaking mission, not just someone who refuses to mow their lawn every Saturday. He's no longer just judging a book by its cover. He's reading the raw, uncensored story that's unfolding, page by painful page. And believe me, Gilbert, you ain't seen nothing yet. This is just the calm before the tempest. A deceptively pleasant introduction before the absolute, no-holds-barred narrative of one woman's incredibly challenging marriage. Brace yourself, Gilbert, and prepare for a masterclass in why good looks are very rarely enough. And so, as Gilbert, undoubtedly feeling more than a little chagrined at his earlier judgments, turns the pages of Helen's journal, a completely different reality begins to unfurl. You're no longer peering into the gloomy mysteries of Wildfell Hall, but are instead transported back in time into the vibrant, if sometimes tragically naive, world of Helen Linton, the young woman she was before becoming the enigmatic Mrs. Graham. It's like finding the origin story of your favorite comic book villain, only to discover they were actually an innocent who had a terrible Tuesday. Helen writes of her younger self with a clarity born of painful experience. She describes her initial fascination, her outright adoration for Arthur Huntingdon. Imagine the quintessential romantic hero of an early 19th century novel. Charming, dashing, witty, well-bred, and undoubtedly possessing a twinkle in his eye that promised adventure and excitement. He probably rode a handsome horse, had perfectly disheveled hair, and knew exactly which lines would sweep a young, impressionable woman off her feet. He's the sort of man who could charm the birds from the trees, and as Helen found out the hard way, probably every shilling from your pocket. You read, perhaps with a growing sense of dread that only hindsight can provide, how Helen's relatives, particularly her sensible Aunt Maxwell and discerning uncle, attempted to temper her ardor. They weren't overtly against Arthur, not precisely, but they possessed a wisdom Helen, blinded by affection and youthful optimism, couldn't yet comprehend. They saw the subtle cracks in Arthur's polished facade, the fleeting moments of self-indulgence, the hint of carelessness. It's like being at the cinema with your parents who keep whispering, "He's clearly the villain, darling, can't you tell from his smug smirk?" while you're utterly mesmerized by the heroic bravado. Historically, parental consent and family approval played a significant role in marriage arrangements among the gentry and aristocracy in the 9th century, more so than simple romantic love, underscoring the deep concern Helen's relatives had about Arthur's character, despite his superficial appeal. But Helen, with the conviction only youth can provide, dismissed their subtle warnings as undue caution, or perhaps even a lack of romantic spirit. She believed she knew him best, that her love could inspire him to be the man she envisioned him to be. Ah, the age-old trap. How many times have we, or someone we know, fallen for the idea of fixing someone, only to realize you can't glue Humpty Dumpty back together if he refuses to even try and gather his shattered pieces? She saw his flirtatiousness as charm, his occasional recklessness as spirited independence. It's the kind of rose-tinted spectacle vision that should really come with a legal disclaimer. An interesting, if unrelated fact. Did you know that honeybees communicate the location of food sources to each other through a complex waggle dance? No societal gossip-mongering there, just efficient information sharing, unlike Lyndon Carr. Helen details the whirlwind courtship and the relatively swift marriage. It's the beginning of what, on the surface, should have been a storybook romance. Arthur is, after all, heir to a respectable estate, handsome and capable of being perfectly agreeable when it suited him. She describes the joy, the initial happiness, the sense of security and belonging that a proper Victorian marriage promised. But even in these early pages, if you, reading alongside Gilbert, pay close attention, you can feel the subtle tremors of unease. It's like watching a seemingly serene lake, knowing that just below the surface, the gears of a terrible storm are slowly grinding into motion. The darker omens begin subtly. Arthur, once the attentive suitor, begins to display traits Helen hadn't fully recognized or had conveniently ignored during their engagement. His preference for indolence over purposeful activity becomes more pronounced. His interest in frivolous company, fellow young men of inherited wealth with too much time and too little responsibility, begins to overshadow his interest in Helen's intellectual pursuits or artistic endeavors. You begin to see him less as the dashing hero and more as that frat boy who peaked in college, convinced that partying is a valid career choice. This gradual shift, Helen records, began to chip away at her initial starry-eyed perception of him. It wasn't an immediate plummet into despair, but rather a slow, insidious erosion of her dreams. This early period of her marriage highlights the societal expectations placed upon women in the 19th century. Once married, a woman effectively ceased to be a legal individual, her rights and property subsumed by her husband in a concept known as femme couverte. You read how Helen tries at first to adapt, to manage, to bring her strong moral compass to bear on Arthur's increasingly wayward inclinations. She employs gentle persuasion, tries to set good examples, and expresses her discomfort. She attempts the delicate dance of influencing her husband without challenging his masculine authority, a tightrope walk for any woman in that era. But the subtle shift reveals Arthur's true character, a man accustomed to having his own way, utterly lacking in self-discipline or respect for anyone else's feelings, especially if those feelings dared to conflict with his immediate gratification. Historians still debate whether societal emphasis on idealized romantic love, heavily pushed through popular novels and poetry, actually harmed women by setting unrealistic expectations for marriage and obscuring the often harsh realities of legal and financial subjugation. Helen's experience, as she writes it, provides compelling evidence for this argument. She believed in love's transformative power, perhaps to her own detriment, imagining she could elevate Arthur to her own level of moral fortitude. The sensory details Helen provides in her diary begin to change. The descriptions of pleasant drawing rooms and elegant dinners slowly give way to the stale scent of cigar smoke clinging to clothes, the clinking of glasses long into the night, the growing echoes of boisterous, often vulgar male laughter emanating from rooms where she was not welcome. Her vision of a shared intellectual and spiritual partnership starts to fade, replaced by the grim realization that her husband's passions lie purely in physical gratification and idle amusements. This isn't the tempestuous, dramatic argument she'd perhaps imagined in a novel. It's a quieter, more devastating kind of disappointment. Like planning a beautiful garden and watching your significant other decide to turn it into a garbage dump, one discarded takeaway box at a time. The air around her gradually cools, filled less with the warmth of love and more with the frosty silence of growing indifference. This was the quiet decay of hope before the much more overt and shattering devastation to come. And Gilbert, poor once judgmental Gilbert, can only read on, his own perception of Mrs. Graham being utterly dismantled by the truth laid bare on every single page. The mystery isn't gone. It's simply reshaped, far more heartbreakingly human than any village gossip could have concocted. All right, let's continue our journey through Helen's unvarnished truth, laid bare for Gilbert and us, dear listener, in the pages of her journal. Having witnessed the initial rather disheartening cracks in Arthur Huntington's polished facade, we are now moving into a period where the mask, as Helen poignantly puts it, doesn't just slip, it rips clean off, revealing the truly unattractive face beneath. You know, like when your new crush looks amazing from a distance, then they get close, and you realize their charm was entirely based on cleverly applied Snapchat filters. Helen, in her candid narrative, reveals how Arthur's initial, charming foibles quickly devolve into far more serious character flaws. What she once saw as a spirited disdain for convention transforms into a profound lack of discipline and a disturbing moral laxity. He begins to neglect his estate responsibilities, allowing matters to slide, choosing idleness over diligence. This might not seem like a massive betrayal on its own, but consider the historical context. A gentleman landowner was expected to manage his property responsibly, ensure the welfare of his tenants, and contribute to local society. Arthur instead prioritizes his own fleeting pleasures. It's like marrying someone you think will be a dynamic CEO, only to discover they're perfectly content binging Netflix and living off ramen noodles indefinitely. And this isn't just a lifestyle choice. It has tangible consequences for the upkeep of the home and the lives of those dependent on the estate. The change isn't abrupt. Helen details it as a slow, corrosive process. It starts with his growing penchant for lavish spending, far beyond what his income reasonably allowed. This wasn't just about enjoying the finer things, it was about heedless consumption, treating money as an infinite resource for immediate gratification. For Helen, a woman of sense and practicality, watching their resources dwindle must have been like living through a slow-motion car crash. She tried, bless her, to offer gentle advice, to suggest prudence, to remind him of their long-term financial health. But her counsel, however logical or well-intentioned, fell on deaf ears. Arthur, you see, was only interested Today's is in immediate pleasures, not boring things like balance sheets or future solvency. It's like advising a squirrel to save its nuts for winter when it just wants to have a party right now and chuck nuts at other squirrels. His increasing drinking is another key marker of his moral decline. At first, it's probably just a bit too much wine with dinner, a brandy too many in the evening. Harmless enough, right? But then, the frequency increases, the quantity swells, and the effects become impossible to ignore. Hangovers morph into persistent headaches, conviviality sours into irritability, and lucidity gives way to slurred speech and unpredictable behavior. In the 19th century, excessive drinking among the upper classes was often an accepted part of social life, even if frowned upon when it reached debilitating levels. Historians still debate whether the societal permissiveness surrounding alcohol contributed to higher rates of addiction and marital discord among the elite, and Helen's personal account definitely offers a grim case study. You begin to smell the stale ale and cheap cigars rising from the very pages of the journal as Helen describes his behavior, the sound of late-night revelry jarring her from uneasy sleep. It's almost as if you can hear her sigh, that deep, soul-weary sigh of disappointment and helplessness. Helen's frustration mounts as she observes the devastating impact of his habits. Her hope that her love, her influence, her steadfast presence could somehow guide him towards a more responsible, virtuous path slowly dwindles. She sees her youthful idealism shattered, replaced by the grim reality of a marriage to a man who, simply put, is not good. He lies, he deceives, he manipulates, and he shows a chilling lack of genuine remorse for the hurt he causes. The charm that initially captivated her transforms into a manipulative tool he wields to evade responsibility and coerce compliance. It's a very harsh lesson, like realizing your prince was actually just a particularly convincing frog in a really nice hat. This decline is further accentuated by the type of friends Arthur begins to cultivate and invite into their home. Gone are the respectable acquaintances. In come a collection of dissolute companions, fellow idle gentlemen, often gamblers, drinkers, and lechers, who egg on Arthur's worst impulses rather than moderating them. Think of the absolute worst college roommate you could imagine, then clone him 5 times and invite them all to live with you permanently. Helen is forced to tolerate their coarse language, their morally dubious jokes, and their open contempt for social graces and, more distressingly, for her presence. They make their home less a sanctuary and more a perpetually noisy, smoke-filled den of iniquity. And of course, since they're her husband's guests, she has very little power to eject them. You're effectively trapped in your own house, held captive by the unpleasant habits of a man who vows to cherish you, but who is too selfish to even grant you basic peace. An odd historical fact to chew on while you consider Helen's predicament. The invention of chewing gum in the late 19th century wasn't originally for refreshment, but as a breath-freshening product after copious eating, possibly a reflection of the lingering stenches of cigars and questionable social hygiene. So perhaps not a bad invention to help with those lingering, questionable late-night house guests, although unlikely to have solved the actual character problems. Helen, watching this deterioration, tries to exert control where she can, especially over their son. She grows protective, guarding her young Arthur against his father's corrupting influence and the dubious company he keeps. This, however, further infuriates Arthur, who sees her attempts at responsible parenting as defiance or interference in his masculine domain. It's like trying to gently redirect a toddler from licking a public handrail, only to have the toddler, in this case her own husband, declare war on your parental authority. This constant friction over their child's upbringing becomes a major battleground, illuminating the chasm that is now opening wide between them. Helen is living proof that not all marriages are built to last. Some, indeed, seem designed to crumble from the inside out, often revealing fundamental incompatibilities far too late. The mask is now entirely off. leaving behind a grim portrait of marital disillusionment that would resonate with many trapped in similar circumstances. The real struggle for survival, for Helen, has only just begun. All right, let's turn another harrowing page in Helen's journal, following her relentless descent into the grim reality of her marriage to Arthur Huntington. The initial charm, that polished mask we discussed, isn't just off. It's been stomped into the ground. What's left is a truly unappealing portrait of dissipation and debauchery. You're not just observing, you're feeling the stifling air of disillusionment and decay, almost smelling the stale smoke and spirits clinging to every fabric of their unhappy home. It's a very particular kind of grim, where despair slowly marinates everything. Helen vividly recounts Arthur's escalating alcoholism. This isn't just occasional tipsiness or the occasional regrettable remark after too much port. This is a full-blown addiction, insidious and consuming. He doesn't just drink for pleasure, he drinks out of habit, out of a festering boredom, out of an almost pathological self-indulgence. The consequences are naturally dire. His wit, once so sharp and engaging, turns cruel and sarcastic. His temper flares unpredictably. His once dashing appearance grows increasingly unkempt, marked by the puffy eyes and florid complexion of chronic heavy drinking. Imagine someone you know becoming a caricature of their worst self, day in and day out. It's heartbreaking, but for Helen, it quickly becomes infuriating and, ultimately, utterly soul-crushing. He gathers around him a coterie of equally dissolute friends, companions whose only apparent purpose in life is to reinforce Arthur's worst impulses and participate in his endless rounds of carousing. There's Lord Lowborough, the melancholy but eventually also debauched fellow, and the truly detestable Hargrave, a constant sneering presence. These aren't friends in the traditional sense. They're enablers, parasites, drawn to Arthur's wealth and the sheer license his position provides. Their conversations, which Helen recounts with obvious disgust, are shallow, often vulgar, and utterly devoid of anything resembling intellectual curiosity or moral rectitude. They celebrate vice, scoff at virtue, and mock anyone who attempts to uphold principles. You can almost hear their raucous laughter echoing down the hallways of Huntington's estate, particularly irritating to a woman of Helen's intelligence and refinement, who clearly prefers a stimulating debate over the repeated recitation of crude jokes. For Helen, living amongst them was like being perpetually stuck in a particularly rowdy and poorly attended pub, surrounded by boors and blowhards, with no escape. A little-known fact that really brings home the environment Helen was living in. Many gentlemen's clubs of the era actively promoted heavy drinking, gambling, and other forms of social dissipation, becoming spaces where proper behavior was often suspended. It's almost as if Arthur's home was replicating that same exclusive and debauched male environment. And just to throw in a bit of fun academic debate, historians still debate whether the moral decline observed in segments of the 19th century British aristocracy and gentry was a direct result of inherited wealth leading to idleness, or if underlying psychological factors like depression or undiagnosed personality disorders played a more significant role in fostering such destructive behaviors. Helen, writing in her journal, clearly assigns the blame to willful moral decay. Helen describes her attempts, increasingly desperate, to exert some positive influence to rescue Arthur from his destructive path. She appeals to his better nature, reminds him of their shared vows, and points to the detrimental effects his behavior is having on their son. But every effort is met with either dismissive indifference, cutting sarcasm, or outright cruelty. Arthur sees her attempts not as genuine concern, but as an intolerable interference with his personal liberty. His concept of liberty, it quickly becomes clear, is simply the freedom to indulge every whim without consequence. It's like trying to reason with a particularly stubborn cat who has just discovered the joys of tearing apart toilet paper rolls. Logic simply does not compute. One of the most heart-wrenching aspects Helen records is the chilling emotional isolation that gradually surrounds her. She's physically present in the marriage, in the grand house, but utterly alone. Arthur withdraws from her emotionally, his affections either dormant or directed elsewhere. The vibrant intimacy they once shared, or rather, the intimacy she believed they shared, is replaced by cold indifference, mutual resentment, and silence punctuated by the cacophony of his boisterous entertainments. You feel her profound loneliness as she describes long evenings spent in solitary study or silent observation, listening to the revelry downstairs, knowing she's been deliberately excluded from her own life. It's like living with a ghost, only the ghost occasionally turns up drunk and insulting. Helen paints a portrait of a woman systematically stripped of hope, of purpose, and eventually of her personal dignity within the confines of her own home. She becomes almost a spectator to her own deteriorating life. Her attempts to protect her son, Arthur, from the toxic environment become a singular, guiding mission. She tries to instill moral values, teach him the importance of temperance and kindness, and shelter him from his father's debauched companions. But this protective instinct naturally creates further tension with Arthur, who, being the exemplary father he is, actually encourages the boy to participate in his drunken games and exposes him to unsavory lessons. It's like a battle for the soul of a child, and Helen is fighting uphill against her own husband. An authoritative historical fact that adds another layer of grim reality. Victorian law greatly limited a mother's legal rights over her children in the event of separation or divorce. The father had almost absolute legal authority, including control over their education and religious upbringing. This made Helen's situation even more precarious, and her desire to protect her son against his father's corrupting influence fraught with immense legal danger and social taboo. She knows she risks everything simply by trying to do what is best for her child. Her profound disappointment with Arthur, this complete disillusionment with the man she chose, slowly morphs into a quiet but steely determination. She cannot change him. She cannot save their marriage, but she can, perhaps, save herself, and, crucially, save her son from succumbing to the same moral decay that has consumed his father. The journey of despair turns now irrevocably toward one of fierce, protective resolution, a stark shift in her narrative that would make anyone reading her journal realize this woman is no helpless victim, but a survivor forging a difficult, dangerous path toward freedom. Her spirit is hardening, tempered by the inferno of Arthur's dissolution, ready to defy the norms and expectations of her time, simply because there's truly nothing else left to lose. As Gilbert, now thoroughly engrossed and quite possibly suffering from a severe case of vicarious exasperation, continues to turn the journal's pages, we delve deeper into the stifling reality of Helen's life at Huntingdon. We've witnessed Arthur's dramatic descent into habitual intemperance and moral dissolution, leaving Helen isolated in her own home, amidst a constant parade of coarse friends. The emotional chasm between Helen and Arthur is no longer a crack, it's a gaping canyon, echoing with their unspoken resentments and her profound loneliness. You can almost feel the chill seeping into the narrative, a creeping dread that settles heavily. Helen writes of her attempts to bridge this ever-widening gap, desperate efforts to appeal to the man she once loved, or at least the potential she once saw in him. She argues, she pleads, she tries to set boundaries, particularly concerning their young son. But all her efforts are met with increasing callousness, sarcastic barbs, and the infuriating indifference of a man entirely consumed by his own pleasure and sense of entitlement. Arthur often makes light of her feelings, treating her genuine distress as female hysteria or tiresome nagging. It's a textbook example of gaslighting, centuries before the term became common currency. He simply can't be bothered with anything that interrupts his endless pursuit of superficial amusement. You could, at this point, write a whole doctoral thesis on the Victorian gentleman's privilege. The atmosphere in their home, once filled with Helen's bright hopes, becomes heavy with her suppressed despair. She chronicles how she retreated, day by day, into a state of quiet resignation, accepting that her attempts at intervention were futile. Her world shrinks. She focuses intently on her son Arthur as a solitary source of solace and purpose. She channels her fierce intelligence and deep moral conviction into his upbringing, hoping to inoculate him against his father's corrosive influence. But even this is a source of bitter contention. Arthur Huntingdon, with his characteristic lack of foresight or genuine concern, often encouraged his son in reckless or immoral behavior, trying to mold him into a miniature version of himself. Imagine trying to teach your child proper etiquette, while their other parent actively encourages them to stick their fork into the nearest electrical socket. The conflict over young Arthur's upbringing became the most volatile battleground, signifying the irreversible collapse of their partnership. An authoritative historical fact here: during the Victorian era, child-rearing manuals often emphasized the mother's moral influence as paramount in shaping a child's character, creating immense pressure and responsibility for women like Helen, who faced unsupportive or damaging spouses. This made her situation particularly tragic and perilous. Her narrative conveys a profound sense of isolation. Arthur begins to spend more and more time away, pursuing his dissolute lifestyle. When he is home, his presence is often worse than his absence. He hosts his friends, transforming their once elegant home into a raucous, smoky den of revelry. Helen withdraws entirely from these scenes, taking her meals alone, spending her evenings sequestered in her rooms, finding meager companionship only in books or the silent presence of her child. You get the sense that she is physically in the marriage, but emotionally and spiritually, she has divorced him entirely. It's like sharing a tiny apartment with someone who keeps a marching band as a hobby and has absolutely no sense of personal space, and then act surprised when you move all your important documents to a locked suitcase. This isn't a joke. It's genuinely debilitating. An interesting tidbit, utterly irrelevant to the plot, but quite useful if you're trying to stave off historical existential dread. The invention of the practical zipper wouldn't happen until the very end of the 19th century, meaning Helen likely battled 1,000 tiny buttons or cumbersome lacings daily. Just another minor annoyance in a life filled with them, really. Speaking of tiny annoyances becoming massive problems, the psychological toll of this enforced separation and the constant tension must have been immense. Helen describes moments of extreme weariness, almost a bone-deep exhaustion, born not from physical exertion, but from the relentless emotional warfare. The social ramifications of their marital discord are also evident. While the specific nature of Arthur's infidelity might still be under wraps, the fact that their marriage is failing is becoming impossible to hide, particularly with Arthur's blatant absences and the scandalous company he keeps. The once bright and promising Mrs. Huntingdon slowly becomes the object of pity, or worse, quiet derision from polite society. Nobody explicitly blames her, perhaps, but a failing marriage in that era always cast a shadow over the wife, regardless of culpability. You know the whispers. Poor dear, she must be so unhappy, often followed by, I wonder what she did to drive him to it. Historians still debate the true societal impact of public marital scandal on women's reputation in Victorian England, questioning whether societal judgment often prioritized the husband's rights to indiscretion over the wife's distress and purity. Helen lives this reality. Her private reflections reveal a deepening sense of dread for her son's future. She sees the potential for young Arthur to follow in his father's footsteps, to inherit not just wealth, but also moral decay. Should he remain under his father's full influence? This fear, above all, starts to steel her resolve. The silent battle she has fought, often losing, gives way to a dawning realization that radical measures are required. She understands that conventional avenues, divorce, for example, being almost impossible and highly scandalous for a woman to pursue in this era, are not open to her. This leads to a fierce determination to act unilaterally, to become the agent of her own liberation, and, more importantly, of her son's salvation. The emotional isolation, instead of breaking her, strengthens her resolve. The long, silent hours in her lonely room become periods of quiet planning, transforming her despair into decisive action. Her misery becomes the engine of her greatest, most daring act of rebellion against the restrictive confines of her unhappy marriage and the unforgiving society that enabled her husband's depravity. Get ready, because her next steps are about to rattle the foundations of 19th century domesticity like a drunken guest falling down a very expensive staircase. We press on, Gilbert, and you, dear listener, gripping the journal tighter as Helen's narrative delves into the most bitter, public, and personally devastating aspects of her marital breakdown. Arthur Huntingdon's increasingly open and flagrant infidelity. The psychological abuse, the emotional abandonment, and the reckless profligacy Helen endured were terrible enough. But now, his betrayals are not only painful, they are a public scandal, deliberately crafted to inflict maximum humiliation. This isn't just about a marriage falling apart, it's about a man using his position and privilege to degrade his wife entirely. Helen details the insidious escalation of Arthur's infidelity. It starts subtly, perhaps with rumors of liaisons during his extended absences. But soon, the secrecy, such as it was, is completely cast aside. He flaunts his dalliances, particularly with the notoriously frivolous Lady Annabella Loughborough, who, quite unluckily for Helen, is a regular within their social circle. Imagine the sheer audacity, the contempt implied by parading his mistress before his own wife within their own home. It's not merely cheating, it's psychological torture, a deliberate campaign to erase Helen's dignity and marital standing. Lady Annabella is portrayed by Helen as a superficial, selfish woman, captivated by Arthur's charisma and indifferent to the suffering of others. This is beyond annoying, it's an active source of anguish. For historical context, adultery was grounds for divorce for a husband in 19th century England, but it was almost impossible for a wife to divorce her husband for it. She needed to prove cruelty, desertion, or bigamy in addition to adultery, a clear double standard that kept women trapped in abusive marriages. This reality makes Arthur's behavior even more horrifying. Helen, with her characteristic fortitude, tries to ignore it at first, perhaps clinging to the fragile hope that it's a fleeting fancy, a momentary lapse of judgment. She struggles with the profound humiliation, not just in her own private heart, but in the glaring eyes of society. She's the poor Mrs. Huntingdon, whose husband is making a fool of her, whose dignity is being trampled in the most public way. The social pressure of enduring such a situation, to keep up appearances and endure it silently, must have been suffocating. It's like being on a reality TV show where everyone knows your husband is cheating and you're forced to keep smiling for the cameras. She's being served a platter of infidelity with a side of public scorn. The descriptions in her journal grow sharper, more direct, brilliant, laden with controlled anger and profound sadness. She recalls moments when Arthur would bring Lady Annabella directly into their shared domestic spaces, treating her with a warmth and consideration he no longer afforded his own wife. Helen often observes them, a silent, heartbroken witness to their blatant displays of affection. Can you feel the bitterness? The chill that would settle around your own heart? It's not just a metaphorical cold shoulder, it's the glacial expanse of a shattered trust. There are passages describing the laughter, the shared glances, the stolen moments Helen endures, locked in her own room, the sounds from downstairs seeping through the walls, each laugh a barb, each whispered endearment a poisoned dart. An interesting tidbit unrelated to infidelity, but quite curious nonetheless. Did you know that during the 19th century, fashionable ladies often wore tiny artificial moles, called beauty spots or patches, on their faces to highlight their complexion, entirely superficial, much like Arthur's transient affections? Perhaps a clever comparison between superficial beauty and equally superficial morals. This public and blatant betrayal serves as a final, decisive blow to Helen's hopes for her marriage. Any illusions she might have harbored about Arthur reforming, about their marriage ever recovering, are utterly annihilated. She doesn't write of explosive arguments, at least not in this context, but of the quiet, crushing realization that she means nothing to him, that her suffering is utterly irrelevant in his pursuit of pleasure. It's the moment of ultimate surrender to the bitter truth, the sound of glass breaking deep within her soul. This realization solidifies her resolve not just to endure, but to escape. Her passive suffering turns into an active determination. Helen recounts an particularly chilling conversation, or rather, an instance of Arthur addressing her directly about it, that solidifies her intent. Arthur, with characteristic arrogance and casual cruelty, virtually confesses his affairs to her, implying that she should simply accept it as a gentleman's prerogative. His sheer indifference to her pain is the ultimate indignity. This public declaration of infidelity, coupled with his shocking lack of remorse, fuels her burgeoning desire for independence and for protecting her child. If society and law won't protect her, if her husband offers only scorn, then she must take matters into her own hands. Historians still fiercely debate the motivations and power dynamics within aristocratic and gentry marriages of the 19th century. How much discreet infidelity was truly tolerated by wives, and how often it pushed them to breaking point, even without recourse for legal action. Helen's journal offers a raw, first-hand account of such a breaking point. This entire grim saga of Arthur's blatant infidelity leads to the turning point. It's the spark that ignites Helen's ultimate resolve to secure her own liberty, and, more critically, to salvage her son's moral future. The fear that her son, young Arthur, will be irrevocably tainted by his father's vile example, and the corrupted atmosphere of his home becomes an unbearable weight. She imagines him growing up mirroring his father's debauched lifestyle, his moral compass completely shattered. This is a future Helen cannot, will not accept. Every ounce of her formidable will and intellect shifts from hoping to change Arthur to meticulously planning her escape and safeguarding her child. It's like watching someone hit rock bottom, not with despair, but with a sudden searing clarity that says, "Enough, no more." And with that fierce determination, you know, as Gilbert now knows, that Helen is about to make one of the most audacious, brave, and utterly scandalous moves a woman of her era could possibly contemplate. This is where her future as the mysterious Mrs. Graham of Wildfell Hall begins to solidify, not in the gossip of a small village, but in the painful, profound reality of a marriage utterly destroyed. The air is as tense. Something truly momentous is about to happen. As Gilbert's eyes continue to race across the meticulous, painful entries of Helen's journal, we reach a pivotal, intensely emotional moment. The layers of indignity, neglect, and open humiliation that Arthur Huntingdon heaped upon her finally forge a singular, desperate, but incredibly brave resolve in Helen. We've seen the dissolution of the marriage, the constant verbal abuse, the financial profligacy, and the final public disgrace of blatant infidelity. Now, her primary fear isn't for herself, not primarily. It's for her young son, also named Arthur, who is steadily growing up immersed in this morally poisonous environment. You can practically hear her inner cry, a mother's fierce roar to protect her child from a path that she now sees as utter destruction. Helen's immediate concern, as she articulates it with terrifying clarity in her journal, is the moral corruption of her son. She observes Arthur Huntingdon, Sr., actively encouraging the boy in vices that echo his own, drinking small amounts of wine at dinner, hearing vulgar stories, witnessing disrespectful behavior, and becoming accustomed to dishonesty and idleness. She sees her son's innocence being chipped away, his innate kindness overshadowed by the bad examples set by his father and his father's repulsive cronies. Imagine seeing your innocent child absorbing toxic lessons from the very person who should be their protector. It's like watching your delicate seedling being intentionally drenched in weed killer by someone who professes to love it. This is a mother's worst nightmare, realized in agonizing slow motion. An authoritative historical fact underscores Helen's urgency. In Victorian England, under common law, fathers had almost absolute legal custody of their children, with mothers having very limited rights. This meant Helen's desire to save her son went directly against the prevailing legal structure and societal norms. Realizing that she has no legal recourse for divorce, the odds stacked overwhelmingly against women, as we've discussed, and that living under the same roof with Arthur Sr. is actively harming young Arthur, Helen begins to formulate a truly audacious, highly scandalous, and dangerous plan. She decides to flee with her son. This isn't just about escape, it's about a radical act of self-preservation and, more importantly, a desperate bid for her child's moral future. She can't stand by and watch her beloved boy descend into the kind of debauchery that has consumed his father. She believes it's her sacred duty as a mother, superseding all other societal obligations, to remove him from that corrosive environment. She plans meticulously, secretly. This isn't a spontaneous outburst of rebellion. It's a cold, calculated strategy born of absolute necessity. She starts to secure her remaining assets, convert some of her paintings into cash, and make quiet arrangements. Her detailed descriptions convey the constant fear of discovery, the stealth required for each step. Imagine having to live a double life, putting on a brave, placid face while secretly dismantling your existence piece by painful piece. Its attention so palpable you could cut it with a blunt Victorian butter knife. She considers where she might go, seeking a remote, unassuming place where she can live independently, raise her son according to her own principles, and be free from Arthur's poisonous influence. Wildfell Hall, that forgotten, desolate estate, begins to feature in her desperate calculations as a possible haven. It is isolated, available, and sufficiently distant from her old life. It provides precisely the kind of obscurity she desperately needs to avoid detection by her estranged husband and his circle, and crucially, avoid public scandal, even though the act of fleeing itself is scandalous enough. Helen also recognizes the immense personal cost of such an act. She understands that by leaving her husband, even to protect her son, she will be utterly condemned by society. She will be seen as a disgraced woman, perhaps a runaway wife, an outcast. She risks poverty, social ostracization, and endless calumny. But her fierce love for her son and her unwavering moral compass override any personal cost. This is the definition of courage born of desperation. There's a particular phrase she uses in her journal, expressing her fervent belief that only by separating her son from his father can she save him from the degradation that she predicts for Arthur Sr. This deep-seated conviction solidifies her purpose and gives her the strength to proceed, knowing she is doing the only morally right thing. Historians still widely debate the various forms of agency women exercised within highly restrictive 19th-century patriarchal societies. Helen's escape is an extreme but potent example of such radical personal agency against overwhelming odds. An interesting, perhaps unexpected fact for you. Did you know that the penny dreadfuls, cheap, sensational serial novels popular in the 19th century, often featured runaway wives or women escaping dire circumstances, hinting at a public fascination with, or even vicarious desire for, such dramatic personal liberation, despite the societal condemnation? So perhaps Helen, despite her circumstances, was not alone in her desires. The tension in Helen's writing becomes almost unbearable as she gets closer to enacting her plan. Every shadow seems to hide a potential spy. Every conversation becomes a test of her composure. She makes the emotional sacrifice, bracing herself for the inevitable, brutal separation from everything she once held dear. trading one kind of confinement for another, the isolation of a secret, precarious existence. Her deep-seated principles, which have sustained her throughout her ordeal, provide the moral framework for her dangerous undertaking. It is a decision rooted in self-preservation and profound maternal love, not petty malice or romantic revenge. It is the genesis of the mysterious Mrs. Graham, not as a woman escaping scandal she caused, but as a woman courageously creating a new life against the very real and violent patriarchal societal structures designed to contain and punish her. The stage is set for her grand, desperate escape. Gilbert, reading these words, must be entirely floored, seeing the entire fabric of his judgment about her unravel before his very eyes. The whispers of the village now sound utterly hollow and profoundly unfair. And so, we arrive at the heart-stopping moment in Helen's journal, the culmination of all her meticulously secret planning and fierce determination. Gilbert, now a silent, humbled witness to her agonizing history, reads of the dramatic, harrowing escape that would eventually bring Helen and her son to the isolated sanctuary of Wildfell Hall. This isn't a gentle exit. It's a desperate flight, steeped in fear, secrecy, and an immense emotional toll. Imagine the frantic adrenaline, the whispered goodbyes that are no goodbyes at all, and the stark reality of leaving behind everything you've ever known, driven by an unshakable conviction that there is no other choice. Helen vividly describes the details of her flight. She selects a time when Arthur is away on one of his frequent dissolute excursions, or perhaps deep in one of his drunken stupors, a fleeting window of opportunity. Every action is cloaked in utmost secrecy. She packs only the barest essentials, careful not to arouse suspicion. Her artistic materials, her cherished books, and the few mementos that link her to her true, pre-Huntingdon self would have been precious cargo, perhaps nestled alongside a few pieces of clothing. She must have had her heart pounding like a frantic drum against her ribs. Imagine gathering your child in the dead of night, slipping through a silent house that has become a gilded cage, knowing that one wrong sound, one creaking floorboard, could mean disaster. An authoritative historical fact: even if Helen had left property behind, any property owned by a married woman before the Married Women's Property Acts, the first major one being 1870, long after this story's setting, legally belonged to her husband. This added immensely to the desperation and poverty of women fleeing unhappy marriages, emphasizing how utterly dependent Helen was on selling her artwork to survive. Her chosen mode of transport, too, would have been secretive, a hired conveyance from a distant town, or perhaps even by foot, and then by public coach, trying to blend in with the common traveler, rather than arriving in a grand style that would immediately mark her as a lady on the run. The journey itself must have been arduous and fraught with anxiety. For Helen, a lady unaccustomed to fending entirely for herself and a small child on the open road, it would have presented practical challenges she rarely faced. You can almost feel the chill of the early morning air as she departs, the smell of damp earth, and the nervous anticipation of discovery. Her sole focus, the engine behind this daring undertaking, is her son, young Arthur. Helen meticulously records her desperate hope that she is saving him from eternal corruption. She constantly worries about his welfare, shielding him from the harsher realities of their precarious journey, and trying to convey a sense of adventure rather than dire escape. It's the protective instinct of a mother, writ large against the backdrop of an unforgiving society. Every bump in the road, every unfamiliar face, every unexpected delay must have brought her close to breaking, but her determination for her child's moral salvation, fueled by his father's utter moral bankruptcy, outweighs all personal discomfort or fear. The destination Helen chose is Wildfell Hall. She carefully explains in her journal why this desolate, long-abandoned estate was her chosen sanctuary. It was far removed from the societal circles of her husband, a place of relative obscurity where she hoped to live unnoticed, free from the prying eyes of gossip and Arthur's potential attempts to reclaim his son. It was decrepit, true, perhaps even a bit ghostly, but for Helen, it represented a tangible promise of independence and the chance to forge a new life on her own terms. It symbolized, in her mind, a blank canvas upon which she could paint a future free from degradation. An interesting, if slightly odd fact about abandoned English estates like Wildfell Hall. It was not uncommon for properties to be left fallow for decades or even centuries if they didn't generate income, as absentee landlords often simply couldn't be bothered with maintenance or finding new tenants for remote, decaying structures. Perhaps an odd detail, but perfectly valid in the context of the dilapidated Wildfell Hall she escapes to. Upon arrival, the stark reality of her new life hits her. Wildfell Hall is indeed dilapidated. Helen must transform this forgotten ruin into a livable home, undertaking repairs, cleaning away years of dust and neglect, all while protecting her true identity and explaining her presence to the suspicious villagers. This isn't some glamorous fresh start. It's an immense task of manual labor and mental fortitude, coupled with the constant psychological pressure of remaining hidden. She chooses to adopt the name Mrs. Graham, shedding the tarnished Huntingdon name to maintain her anonymity. It's an almost ritualistic act of severance, burning the bridges to her old life to save her future. The writing reveals the profound solitude she embraced. She isolates herself not because she is misanthropic, but out of necessity and a desire for absolute privacy. Her existence is one of constant vigilance, of balancing the urgent need for a self-sufficient life with the paramount need to keep her true identity secret. Her past, contained within these very journals, becomes her prison and her confidant. Gilbert, reading these entries, now fully comprehends the sheer weight of Helen's previous enigmatic demeanor, her stoicism, and her seemingly antisocial behavior. He finally understands that every careful answer, every reserved gesture he observed, was not about maliciousness or mysterious sin, but about absolute survival. She was protecting her life, her secret, and her son's future from the predatory reach of her past. All the village gossip, all of his suspicions evaporate like morning mist under a clear sun. They are replaced by awe and a profound sense of sympathy for the quiet strength this woman had demonstrated. This entire story of her desperate escape stands as a powerful testament to the often unseen, often heroic acts of courage performed by women seeking autonomy and agency in eras where very little of it was legally or socially granted. Historians still widely debate how much societal acceptance, if any, there was for women like Helen, who challenged prevailing gender norms and married women's subservience, and Helen's solitary struggle clearly indicates the profound personal cost. The mystery, dear listener, isn't whether she was bad. It's how she managed to be so unbelievably good and brave in the face of such adversity. And her fight, far from over, was only just beginning to truly reshape her destiny. With the thrilling narrative of Helen's escape to Wildfell Hall fresh in Gilbert's mind, and ours, we now move into the next phase of her arduous journey, building a new, solitary life in a desolate place, constantly under the microscopes of suspicion and judgment. The journal entries detail not only the physical hardships of her new existence, but also the intense emotional and social battles she was forced to wage. She might have escaped her oppressive husband, but she hadn't escaped the equally stifling strictures of 19th century society. Helen recounts the immense physical effort required to make Wildfell Hall habitable. It was, as we recall, a decaying ruin, and transforming it into a home for herself and young Arthur involved cleaning, minor repairs, and considerable self-sufficiency. This isn't the romantic ideal of rustic living. It's hard, unrelenting work, quite unlike the life a lady of her breeding would have led. She does much of it herself, occasionally hiring local laborers, all the while carefully guarding her privacy and maintaining a demeanor that would discourage probing questions. You can almost feel the aches in her bones, the grime under her fingernails, and the satisfaction of gradually reclaiming a space that symbolized her independence. She must have spent countless hours sweeping away dust that accumulated since the Norman conquest and brushing cobwebs the size of small elephants. It was an exercise in pure willpower. The primary challenge, however, comes from the villagers of Linden Carr. As we learned at the very beginning, their curiosity was insatiable, their judgment swift. Helen, in her desire for seclusion, inadvertently drew more attention to herself. Her aloofness, her mysterious background, her unusual self-sufficiency, all became grist for the relentless mill of village gossip. Helen accurately perceived the intense scrutiny she was under. Every trip to the market, every fleeting encounter with a neighbor was analyzed, debated, and embellished. She found herself caught in an impossible bind. Too much openness would betray her past, but too much reserve made her an object of deep suspicion. She literally couldn't win, no matter how hard she tried to just live her life. Helen chronicles the specific rumors and the underlying prejudice she encountered. She describes polite invitations turning cold when she politely declined, neighborly inquiries becoming outright interrogations, and innocent questions morphing into pointed accusations. She hears the whispers. Is she really a widow? Where is her husband? Why does she avoid society? Did she elope? Is her son legitimate? The constant insinuation that she was a woman of dubious morals, a fallen woman perhaps, must have been a daily affront to her inherent dignity. Historically, a woman living alone or without overt male protection in rural Victorian England was inherently suspect, regardless of her actual conduct. Society frequently assumed she had something to hide, placing an enormous burden on women like Helen, even if she was just really introverted. Her art, the very means by which she sustained herself financially, ironically contributed to her notoriety. Painting was a respected skill, yes, but for a lady of her presumed status, to sell her works was often seen as a sign of desperate straits, a kind of unladylike venture into the commercial world. Her self-reliance, intended as strength, was often misinterpreted as an abnormal or defiant independence. The phrase, "women should ideally only marry wealthy men, even if it leads to misery," could have been a sign above many village houses. An interesting little off-topic fact that has no bearing on anything. The first photograph of a human being was taken in 1838, around this period. Though the exposure time was so long, the street appeared deserted, perhaps reflecting Helen's desire for her own life to become photographically and gossipily empty of visible figures. Helen focuses significantly on her deep devotion to her son, Arthur. He is her reason for enduring the isolation and calumny. She diligently educates him, instills moral values, and ensures he learns temperance, responsibility, and kindness, all the virtues his father explicitly lacked. This deep maternal bond, a powerful counterpoint to the relentless scrutiny from outside, is the anchor of her new existence. She notes his occasional questions about his father, questions she tries to answer with careful honesty, protecting him from the full, grim reality while also ensuring he develops his own, unblemished moral compass. This part of her journal is a profound meditation on endurance and the quiet strength required to live an unconventional life in a conventional world. She learns to cultivate self-possession, to not react to provocation, and to develop a serene, outward demeanor that belied her inner turmoil. She built walls, metaphorical ones of dignity and reserve, around herself and her son, hoping to keep the poisoned darts of gossip from reaching them. You witness her transition from a grieving, isolated woman to a steely, independent one, honed by adversity into someone unbreakable. Historians still widely debate how individuals, particularly women, carved out spaces for personal autonomy within societies characterized by strict social hierarchies and gender expectations. Helen's self-imposed isolation and artistic work were certainly powerful, if highly challenging, means of achieving a degree of control over her own destiny. The air in the narrative becomes charged with this struggle between Helen's quiet determination and the relentless tide of societal disapproval. Gilbert, having previously judged her for this very stoicism and isolation, now reads her account with profound understanding and respect. He sees how unfair his previous judgments were, how easily influenced he was by shallow gossip. He comprehends the incredible sacrifice she made to protect her integrity and her child. This section vividly paints the picture of the formidable Mrs. Graham as a figure of enduring strength, not a mysterious sinner. The silence of Wildfell Hall isn't emptiness. It's a bulwark, a haven, painstakingly built and fiercely defended by a woman whose quiet struggle for dignity against the world defines her. The reader, like Gilbert, becomes utterly captivated by her resilience, completely disarmed of any prejudice by the undeniable power of her narrative. Gilbert, likely a little emotional, and more than a little shamefaced after absorbing Helen's harrowing tales of societal scorn and solitary survival, reaches a pivotal moment in her journal entries. Her story now takes a truly unexpected and perhaps agonizing turn: the illness and eventual gruesome death of Arthur Huntingdon. This part of Helen's narrative strips away any lingering sense of resentment or injustice and plunges into the complexities of human mercy, duty, and the brutal reality of an unredeemed life's end. And you brace yourself for it, the way you'd brace yourself for a sharp corner on a roller coaster. It's not a triumphant death. It's a grim, lonely reckoning. Helen recounts how news eventually reaches her at Wildfell Hall. Arthur Huntingdon is gravely ill. His years of debauchery, of excessive drinking, and neglect of his health have finally caught up with him. It's a cruel, poetic justice, but Helen writes of it not with gloating, but with a complex mix of feelings that demonstrate her profound moral compass. She recognizes the inherent tragedy of a life so utterly wasted, even if it was a life that caused her unimaginable pain. She doesn't find joy in his suffering. Rather, a deeper melancholy permeates her prose. The silence in the journal speaks volumes. It's the calm before a final storm. Despite the monumental pain and degradation he inflicted upon her, Helen makes a shocking decision. She returns to nurse him in his final illness. You stop, don't you? Just like Gilbert probably did? Why, you might whisper. Why would she subject herself to that again? Her motivations are clear and meticulously explained in her journal. She considers it a moral duty, perhaps even a Christian obligation, to offer what succor she can to a dying man, especially the father of her son. There's also the underlying knowledge that no one else among his dissolute companions cares enough to truly attend to him. They only cared for his money and his party spirit. He is abandoned even by those he called friends. An authoritative historical fact here. In the 19th century, death was a far more intimate and domestic affair than it is today. Nursing the sick, particularly family members, was often a fundamental part of women's domestic responsibilities, regardless of the relationship's history, showcasing Helen's adherence to social expectations, even in extreme circumstances. She knew the eyes of his remaining servants, and his few genuine, if often bewildered relatives would be upon her. Her descriptions of his last days are harrowing. Arthur is racked by pain, weakened, and stripped of his arrogance by the proximity of death. He tries, in fleeting moments of clarity, to exert his old dominance, to manipulate, even to wound Helen with his words, showing that his character, though weakened, is fundamentally unchanged. But these attempts often fail, lost in his delirium or undercut by his own weakness. You are witness to the pitiful unraveling of a once vibrant, albeit morally corrupt, man. It's like watching a grand, ornate building crumble to dust, but knowing all along it was rotting from within. His suffering, though deserved in a karmic sense, elicits Helen's pity rather than triumphant satisfaction. One particular, unrelated, odd fact that might cross your mind while considering these grim realities. During the 19th century, a popular medical device known as a bloodletting phlegm was still occasionally used to balance bodily humors, ironically often contributing to a patient's decline rather than recovery. So perhaps Arthur's doctors added insult to injury, so to speak. Back to Helen's story. She observes him without illusions, recognizing the depth of his self-delusion even on his deathbed. He expresses superficial remorse, but Helen is astute enough to see that it lacks genuine understanding or repentance. He grieves not for the harm he inflicted, but for his own impending loss of pleasure and life itself. Historians still debate the role of deathbed repentance in 19th century moral thought, whether a late confession could truly absolve a life of sin, or if true repentance required active reform and remorse in life. Helen, it seems, is a staunch realist in this matter. The ultimate moment of Arthur's passing is grim, solitary. He dies, abandoned by all save Helen and perhaps a few terrified servants. She stays until the end, performing her duty with unwavering strength, her compassion tempered by the years of abuse she endured. It's a somber and poignant scene, devoid of any Hollywood-esque reconciliation or dramatic outpouring of emotion. It simply is. It is the final closing of a truly terrible chapter in her life, not with fireworks, but with the quiet, unsettling realization that such a destructive force has finally been extinguished. You feel the profound exhaustion she must have felt as the last breath left him, the crushing weight of responsibility lifted, but the emotional scars still vividly present. This segment of Helen's journal, revealing her return to Nurse Arthur, irrevocably alters Gilbert's perception of her. He no longer sees the haughty, mysterious recluse, but a woman of immense moral courage, fortitude, and an almost superhuman capacity for mercy. The whispers and calumnies of Lyndon Carr, his own included, are fully and completely debunked. The true, unspeakable agony and the moral triumph of Helen Graham are revealed, painted not just in the strokes of a pen, but in the grim final image of a duty completed, however unpleasant, leaving her to emerge from the wreckage of her marriage not just as a survivor, but as a morally and ascendant force. She has witnessed the complete, unredeemed ruin that her own choices, or rather her limited choices within society's rules, have led her to, and now, at long last, she is truly, legally free. What a moment! The air around her is clearer now, finally scrubbed clean of his toxic presence, ready for a profoundly different kind of dawn. As Gilbert closes the heavy journal and takes a slow, shaky breath, the oppressive cloud of Arthur Huntington's presence finally dissipates, not just from Helen's life, but from the very pages of her narrative. We've endured the slow, agonizing death of a man whose moral rot infected everything around him, a scene made even more poignant by Helen's grim, dutiful vigil. Now the atmosphere shifts, a gentle breeze rustling through the pages, hinting at liberation and a new, unexpected kind of hope. You feel a distinct lightening of the spirit, a subtle promise of better days, like the quiet before a much-needed rain. Helen's journal entries after Arthur's death transition initially into a period of quiet grief and exhaustion. She wasn't grieving for Arthur the husband, certainly not for the partner who inflicted so much pain. Her grief was, rather, for the lost hopes of her youth, for the future she had envisioned, and perhaps even for the squandered potential of a human being. There's a solemnity in her writing, a profound weariness, but underlying it is a clear sense of emancipation. The long, silent struggle is over. She is, finally, free. From the physical, emotional, and legal bonds of her oppressive marriage, you feel her profound sense of relief, a deeply earned quiet that settles upon her, a stillness after a protracted storm. Her next step, Helen notes, is to legally confirm her status as a widow and ensure her son's inheritance, a process likely complicated by Arthur's financial irresponsibility during his lifetime. This requires dealing with lawyers, his remaining and mostly relieved family, and the tedious intricacies of Victorian law. For a woman who had spent so long living in careful seclusion, this re-entry into even a limited public sphere must have been jarring, though necessary. This marks her true emergence from widow's weeds, not just symbolically casting off mourning clothes, but casting off the psychological burdens of her past life. The journal describes her careful, methodical steps towards re-establishing her independence. She still holds on to her anonymity to a degree, not out of fear of Arthur, but out of a deeply ingrained caution from years of being scrutinized and a desire to control the narrative of her life. She's learned, the hard way, the destructive power of gossip and the value of self-reliance. This time she will choose when and how she steps back into the world, if she chooses to at all. Her identity as Mrs. Graham, though once a necessary shield, now represents her resilience and her hard-won autonomy. Crucially, with her husband's death, Helen gains legal control over her own person and, to a greater degree, her child. As a widow, she no longer operates under the legal concept of femme covert, meaning she can own property, manage her finances, and act independently. This shift in legal status is enormous and incredibly liberating. She no longer has to hide her income from her painting or worry about her husband squandering it. She can now legally direct her son's education and upbringing without fear of his father's destructive interference. An authoritative historical fact here: the status of widows in Victorian society was significantly more advantageous than that of married women, particularly concerning property and personal rights, often making widowhood, paradoxically, a path to independence for some women who had endured miserable marriages. This sheds light on why Helen can finally reclaim her agency now. Her writings detail her deep joy in being able to freely and openly educate her son without external pressure. She cultivates his character, instilling in him the virtues of temperance, integrity, and kindness, shaping him into the man she desires him to be, precisely what Arthur Huntingdon was not. This bond with her son becomes her primary source of happiness and purpose, embodying her successful struggle against all odds. It's an incredibly heartwarming shift in focus from bitter endurance to active, loving creation. Helen's narrative slowly, deliberately, reintroduces elements of cautious optimism. The beautiful Yorkshire countryside, once merely a backdrop to her isolation, can now be fully appreciated for its tranquility and natural beauty. She begins to entertain the notion of a quiet, peaceful life, finally unburdened. The air around Wildfell Hall no longer feels desolate. It feels, almost miraculously, like a refuge that has truly earned its name. You feel her beginning to exhale, finally relaxing after years of constant tension. There's an odd historical aside, purely for amusement, but perhaps useful to highlight Helen's resilience. Did you know that fashionable ladies in the Victorian era would sometimes carry around small, ornate, flirtation fans, the subtle movements of which were a language all their own, completely irrelevant to our sober, liberated Helen, but a testament to how complex social signaling once was, perhaps a world she now felt delightfully freed from. This period also shows Helen slowly coming to terms with her past, integrating the pain and lessons learned, but no longer allowing them to define her entirely. She looks forward, no longer perpetually glancing over her shoulder. This is a vital turning point. Her past doesn't vanish, but it no longer holds her captive. The chains are broken, and she is tentatively, bravely stepping into the sun. The Helen Gilbert first encountered, the mysterious Mrs. Graham of Wildfell Hall, was a woman burdened by secret sorrow. Now, she is the dignified, courageous Helen Graham, slowly shedding that defensive exterior, ready for whatever a truly free life might offer. Her story, recounted in the meticulous detail of her journal, reveals her to be a survivor in the purest sense of the word. Gilbert, now deeply enamored but also humbled, has had every last prejudice stripped away and sees her not as a mystery, but as a masterpiece of strength. Historians still debate the enduring legacy of the angel-in-the-house ideal for Victorian women. Was total domestic subservience the only path to virtue, or could strength be found outside such roles? Helen, by forging her own path, offers a powerful personal counter-narrative, standing as a living, breathing testament to resilience and fierce moral fortitude, a beacon for all who dare to seek true liberation. The scene is set now for their paths to finally truly converge. With Arthur Huntingdon finally laid to rest, both physically and within the pages of Helen's deeply personal journal, Gilbert reaches the penultimate stage of his extraordinary education. He's devoured every word, his heart a turbulent sea of revelation and regret, his initial prejudice utterly dismantled. You've journeyed with him, piece by agonizing piece, through Helen's marriage to disillusionment, her defiant escape, and her solitary struggle. Now, all those hidden truths coalesce, illuminating her entire being and setting the stage for a dramatic shift in their relationship. Helen's journal concludes with her emerging from widowhood, legally free, emotionally resolute, and focused on her future and her sons. It leaves Gilbert, as it leaves us, with a complete understanding of her enigmatic persona. He now knows the precise reasons for her secrecy, her reserve, her unwavering independence, and her quiet fortitude. The layers of misunderstanding that the village gossip, and Gilbert himself, had draped over Mrs. Graham are ripped away, revealing the brave, morally upright woman she always was. Every why he had silently asked of her during their earlier interactions is now answered with heartbreaking clarity. He understands her aloofness was protection, her silence, defiance. His reaction, meticulously recounted in his narrative after finishing hers, is one of profound shame and regret for his earlier judgments. You can almost see him clenching his fists, wanting to go back in time and throttle his earlier, foolish self. He realizes how narrowly he came to truly alienate a woman of immense courage and integrity, simply by being swayed by superficial appearances and malicious rumors. This is a common human flaw, isn't it? To trust whispers over one's own good instincts, to judge a book by its cover, or worse, by what other people are saying about the cover. He grapples with the injustice she faced, acknowledging the enormous personal cost of her brave actions and the cruel limitations society placed on women of her era. Historians still fiercely debate the pervasive influence of reputation in 19th century society and its crushing effects on women who, for various reasons, deviated from prescribed norms. Helen's detailed narrative provides vivid first-hand testimony of its impact. The central conflict that plagued Gilbert's understanding, Helen's marital status and the mystery surrounding her son, is resolved. He understands she is a true widow, having made extraordinary sacrifices, not an unfaithful wife or a social pariah. He sees her unblemished moral character, standing in stark contrast to his own earlier petty jealousies and baseless suspicions. This profound truth allows their paths, previously divergent, to finally converge on a common ground of respect and empathy. All the earlier romantic angst on Gilbert's part is reframed. He wasn't truly loving the Mrs. Graham of the village. He was fascinated by a puzzle. Now, he sees the real Helen and understands the deep foundation required for true affection. This newfound understanding transforms Gilbert's love for Helen. It's no longer a shallow infatuation born of mystery or wounded male pride, but a mature, profound respect and admiration. He doesn't just want her, he reveres her. He comprehends the incredible strength, integrity, and resilience that defines her, making her far more captivating than any conventional woman of his acquaintance. Their renewed interactions, as described by Gilbert, are marked by a deep sense of mutual respect. He approaches her now, not with questions and suspicion, but with genuine humility and a newfound appreciation for her life experiences. The narrative portrays the tentative rebuilding of trust based on this unshakable knowledge of her past. It's almost like they've known each other for years, seeing into the very depths of each other's souls. An odd, completely irrelevant, but still interesting fact. Around this period, the game of cricket was gaining immense popularity in England, with complex rules and rituals, far more intricate than the straightforward, let's judge our neighbor without evidence game played in Lindencar. Perhaps more time on the cricket pitch would have led to less gossiping. Their conversations after Gilbert finishes the journal are imbued with a quiet intimacy. He is finally able to speak with her, directly and openly, about the dark chapters of her life. Helen, in turn, no longer needs to guard her secrets. She can, at last, share the full truth of her struggles without fear of condemnation from him. This open communication is a monumental leap for both of them, forging a bond far stronger and more meaningful than anything they could have built before this raw disclosure. This section, more than any other, celebrates the power of truth and empathy. It shows how judgment, even if well-intentioned, can blind individuals to the reality of others' experiences, and how profound understanding can only truly emerge when those barriers are dismantled. Gilbert's journey from prejudiced observer to empathetic confidant is a powerful arc. He has witnessed firsthand the silent heroism required to simply survive a life designed to crush a woman's spirit, and in doing so, his own character has deepened. He has shed the last vestiges of his male ego, now seeing Helen not as a conquest or a mystery to be solved, but as a fully realized human being worthy of deep affection and genuine respect. This new deeper connection is what ultimately lays the groundwork for any future shared between them. The atmosphere crackles, not with tension, but with the quiet potential of a hard-won, true connection, finally, truly beginning. The path has cleared, and a future, however unlikely, now gleams on the horizon, not through fate, but through profound empathy and an acceptance of the messy, painful realities of the past. This isn't just about love, it's about absolute understanding, a kind of bond so deep it could only have been forged in the fires of mutual truth. And now, as Gilbert, profoundly moved and entirely humbled, has absorbed every poignant detail of Helen's remarkable story, we arrive at the culmination of this extraordinary journey. The turbulent currents of misunderstanding, societal prejudice, and deeply personal suffering finally yield to the gentle flowing tide of a hard-won affection and an enduring partnership. You've journeyed alongside Helen and Gilbert, witnessed the shattering of a cruel marriage, and the quiet heroism of a woman determined to forge her own destiny. The final pages of the narrative unfold not with dramatic explosions, but with the tender promise of quiet solace and deep, abiding love. The stage is set for a future between Helen and Gilbert. With his newfound, complete understanding of her past and his immense admiration for her character, Gilbert no longer hesitates. His earlier infatuation, tinged with curiosity and pride, has matured into a profound and unwavering love, rooted in empathy and a shared experience of truth. He sees her not as the enigmatic Mrs. Graham, nor as a woman burdened by scandal, but as Helen, a woman of unshakable integrity, fierce resilience, and remarkable capacity for love and duty. He cherishes her wisdom, born of suffering, and reveres her strength, honed by adversity. His respect is palpable, elevating their relationship beyond mere romantic convention. Helen, in turn, finds in Gilbert a steadfast, understanding partner. Having revealed the innermost sanctuary of her pain and perseverance in her journals, she has tested his mettle and found him worthy. She discovers a trust in him that was shattered in her previous marriage, his willingness to see her fully, to embrace her complicated past without judgment, offers her a peace and security she perhaps never believed she would experience again. She has faced enough deceit to appreciate his sincerity, enough betrayal to value his loyalty. It's a connection forged in fire, stripped bare of illusion, and built on a foundation of profound mutual understanding and acceptance. Historians still debate the extent to which companionate marriage, based on mutual respect and affection rather than primarily property or social status, was truly prevalent or aspirational in the 19th century. But Helen and Gilbert's eventual union seems to exemplify this ideal. Their journey to marriage is not without its delicate complexities, of course. Society's gaze, though no longer purely malicious, still holds some weight. But for Helen and Gilbert, the whispers of Lyndon Carr are now mere background noise, muted by the strength of their shared bond and Helen's finally clear, unassailable status as a respectable widow. They make their vows not lightly, but with a deep awareness of the journey they've traveled, a shared understanding of life's bitter lessons, and an unshakable commitment to building a life founded on honesty and profound respect. The wedding, you can imagine, is perhaps a quieter affair, intimate, symbolizing the hard-won nature of their joy. No ostentatious display, just the heartfelt commitment of two souls who have truly seen and understood one another. Their shared life together is depicted as one of quiet domestic contentment and intellectual partnership. Gilbert, far from wishing to dominate or control her, deeply values Helen's intelligence and judgment. She continues her art, not as a desperate means of subsistence, but as an expression of her rich, inner life. Her son, Arthur, now with a loving, stable paternal figure in Gilbert, flourishes under their combined guidance, growing into a morally sound and happy young man, saved, indeed, by his mother's brave sacrifice. The cycle of paternal neglect and debauchery is definitively broken. It's like finding the perfect ingredient that brings out all the wonderful flavors you knew were hiding in your dish all along. An entirely random, fascinating historical fact for you. The Postal Service was surprisingly efficient by the mid-19th century in Britain, making it easier for people like Gilbert and Helen to maintain contact across distances, possibly smoothing the path of their courtship once her story was known to him. Far less cumbersome than today's constant barrage of emails and texts. The conclusion of the story brings a profound sense of satisfaction, not of a saccharine fairy tale ending, but of a true, deeply earned peace. It's a testament to endurance, to the transformative power of empathy, and to the courage of living authentically, even against immense societal pressure. Helen Graham, the mysterious tenant, transcends her past not by forgetting it, but by allowing its hard-won wisdom to shape a future defined by dignity and love. Her narrative provides a searing critique of patriarchal society, revealing how its strictures can entrap and diminish, but also celebrating the fierce, resilient spirit of a woman who dares to defy those confines. The narrative suggests that true happiness, a lasting peace, comes not from conventional paths or superficial appearances, but from honest self-knowledge, profound compassion, and a connection built on the solid bedrock of mutual truth and unwavering respect. Gilbert, the eager young farmer, has grown into a man worthy of Helen, understanding that love isn't about romantic illusion, but about acknowledging and valuing the full, complex, often painful truth of another person. It's a gentle whisper of happily ever after, not because life is perfect, but because they have found the strength and love to navigate its imperfections together, finally and truly at peace. Tonight, as the lingering echoes of Helen's extraordinary story begin to fade, let your mind wander through the rolling Yorkshire hills, softened now by the gentle touch of twilight. The imposing shadows of Wildfell Hall no longer hold secrets, but bear witness to a life bravely lived and a peace truly found. Imagine the soft rustle of autumn leaves outside, or the quiet drip of rain on your window pane. each sound contributing to a tranquil rhythm, washing away the echoes of societal judgment and personal turmoil. Helen Graham's journey wasn't one of soaring triumphs that caught the world's eye, but a quiet, deeply personal odyssey through the profound hardships of an unloving world. She showed us that immense courage often wears a plain dress, that the fiercest battles are sometimes fought in the stillness of one's own heart, and that true strength lies not in social standing, but in an unyielding moral compass. Her story, passed through Gilbert's reverent hand, teaches us the vital importance of empathy, of looking beyond the superficial, and understanding that behind every enigmatic face might lie a world of unseen struggle and unsung heroism. Let the final image in your mind be of quiet contentment, the sort of peace that comes from a life honestly earned, deeply felt, and truly understood. Now, as the world outside dims further, let your own thoughts gently soften, your breathing deepen. You can almost feel the reassuring warmth of a quiet room, the peaceful certainty that some storms do indeed pass. Drift into sleep now, enveloped in the quiet strength of a woman's unbreakable spirit and the gentle comfort of a well-told story, fading into the peaceful hum of your quiet dreams. Good night.